Okay, so welcome to stop 3, standing next to the prison. What we see in front of us here, you'll have walked down through Horse Guards. We're now at the point where we're close to the railway bridge and Central Station right in front of you. You can see several really interesting features from this perspective, and if you think about what we discussed at the very start of these valleys that actually travel in an east-west direction and all end up down in the Exe, so thinking about the Tadderford Brook, we're now at the next brook over. This is essentially where the Long Brook runs down, underneath what is now currently Central Station. This is really, really important because you look at this environment and you think it's completely natural, and it is far from natural. And one of the most sort of devastating chapters in the city's history helped to actually change this landscape. So you might argue for the better or for the worse, but it was a significant change. And it's all to do with the outbreak of cholera in the city in 1832. Cholera, as you're well aware, is devastating, has the potential to kill people. In 1831 there'd been a massive outbreak of cholera in Russia, and it sort of quite rapidly worked its way towards Britain, and in early 1832 found its way to Exeter. It was brought, it is said, to Exeter from a woman who arrived at Plymouth. And if you think back to this time, here was a period when there was no piped water, there was no sanitation, and the very places that people actually dumped excrement were the same places that they drew their drinking water from. There was no purification at this time. Most people who were reasonably wealthy drew their water from springs that rose in places like St Sidwell's, which is the other side of the city centre. Many poorer people had no choice than to simply actually draw water from the many brooks that actually cross the city. And the Long Brook and then the Shoot Brook, which is further over the other side of the city centre, were classic places where actually many poorer people drew their water from. The other main source, of course, being the much larger River Exe, which is across to the west. In this particular instance, the Long Brook was blamed for the cholera outbreak in 1832. And it was so devastating, it killed well over 400 people in Exeter. The burial grounds in Exeter couldn't cope, and there was a big sort of furore, big debate in the city as how to dispose of the dead from that event. Everything from sort of how to sort of burn people, bodies, how to actually sort of cover bodies in lime, how to actually stop the spread of cholera. And it had such a profound effect that after this event, public health actually became a real concern. And the Long Brook, which, as I said, runs sort of from the area around St James, quite close to the station, down and crosses in the sort of bow in the lowest point of Longbrook Street, which still exists just up there, and then actually ran down this valley, which was initially 80 feet deeper. This was actually culverted, it was covered up, and an area behind us here that we see was covered over at first to actually sort of allow for greater building, but then upon the sort of arrival of the railway, the line that currently runs to Waterloo. And that opened in July 1860. So the landscape that you see behind us here is one that is very, very altered. That whole area as you go up towards Mount Pleasant, that valley as such with the railway line in, was carved out. It was carved out by hand, an incredibly onerous task. And the area down here, to create a reasonably level plain for the railway line to Exeter Central, was filled in to a depth of 80 feet. So really significant topographic variability, the result of big social change, advances in transport, advances in thinking around public health, actually changed the landscape of the city here really fundamentally. And if you look now behind us here, across you've got the castle, which is obscured by the trees in the background. This is Rougemont Castle, Norman Castle in the background, where we'll go later on. You don't really notice how significant the sort of drop here is into the Longbrook Valley, and that's because much of that has been infilled to make way for the railway. This was also a period in the middle of the 19th century that saw phenomenal growth. If you think about the sort of industrial revolution, Britain was the powerhouse of the world. British cities grew at an immense rate between sort of 1820 and the sort of latter part of the 1800s. This was a time that saw big advances in living standards. It saw towards the end of the 19th century sanitation, it saw running water arriving in houses at the end of the 19th century. It also saw a huge demand for new housing spurred on by population growth. People were starting to live longer, population was expanding, and that's why if you look around this whole area you see evidence of that in the three-storey buildings that you can see just to the right of me here, and all around the city centre. This was a period in which you saw a lot of sort of red brick development, and that's something that we'll explore in further detail at subsequent stops.